Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name's Matt Rosu. I'm Dean of the Sigmund Weiss School of Business at Susquehanna University, where I'm also a professor of economics. Excited today to have David Kendall with us. David's got to know David when we were colleagues at RTI International, which can't believe I'm old enough to say was literally 20 years ago when I was there, 20 years ago at RTI. He went on to be a professor of economics and finance at UVA Wise, which is his current role. I believe, was there a stint in department chair in there as well, David?
For 15 years.
Yeah, okay, that qualifies as a bit more than a stint. I don't know quite how to phrase a 15-year stretch, but department chair there. And the reason I'm excited to have him here today is to talk about his book and some of his ideas around morality and capitalism. So his book is titled Morality and Capitalism, A Dialogue on Freedom. We'll put a link in the description. If you don't have it, highly recommend you pick it up, and you'll get a glimpse of some of these concepts today. But the book's it's an easy read, it's a good read, it's an entertaining read, but it's also thought-provoking, so I highly recommend you check that out. So David, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So I want to start out, right? The title of the book is Morality and Capitalism, A Dialogue on Freedom. And I think a key way to start is with the definition. So I'll start with morality. How do you define morality? What's a good working definition for morality?
Okay, I'll probably be saying some things that sound strange to people, but when I decided to write this book, Matt, it was because I myself had not given very much thought to the central question of whether capitalism is a moral social system of political economy or not. And as it happened, I'd been doing a lot of reading in philosophy over the past, before this book was written, for about 10 years. And I find philosophy quite fascinating. I've always believed, since Deirdre McCloskey pointed it out, that economics has much more philosophical content than most people recognize. And so I got interested in this notion of morality, and I didn't really have a good working definition. And I'm kind of a guy that likes to go to the brass tacks and hurry and try to get down to something that you can grasp onto and sink your teeth into. And so after having done just a whole lot of reading of a whole lot of authors concerning morality, I came up with this idea that in addition to the usual sorts of definitions for morality that come from typically a religious context, the Golden Rule is probably the most famous and well-known definition of what moral behavior is. Moral behavior, according to the Golden Rule, which actually the Golden Rule in the Christian tradition was predated by many centuries in at least 10 other religious traditions, which I mention in my book, by the way, just for fun. Yeah. Well, anyway, the Golden Rule, of course, says do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and a simple set of words that most people remember. And I got to thinking about that and thinking, well, is that a useful guide? Is that a guide that you'll always be steered correctly if you follow that? We always behave morally then. And for the most part, the answer is yes. We certainly couldn't throw away the Golden Rule. But then I got to thinking, you know what? I think that there's an even simpler conception or idea about morality that has an interesting property. The interesting property of what I'm getting ready to tell you is that everyone in all places, in all times, agrees with what I came to call in my book the moral imperative.
Sure.
Yeah, I followed Kant. You know, he has this categorical imperative, and he wrote a lot about morality too. And so I said, well, you know, I'm going to use that model, but I'm going to call it the moral imperative, the moral imperative. Okay, and I got to thinking about, well, how could you put this? And I literally believe it is true. Everyone who's ever lived in every place that there's ever been, in every time that has ever existed, which is a very powerful, broad claim,
Yep.
agrees that this is a true statement. And it goes like this: do not compel others unjustly. That's it.
Yep.
How many words is that? Do not compel others unjustly. That's 5 words. 5 words. And I debated with myself for a long time as I was writing the book whether I needed the word unjustly, and I finally concluded that I did. And that introduces a bag of worms that you have to deal with, but it's doable.
Sure.
So there it is. My definition of morality is just that: do not compel others unjustly. And so whatever else is true, if you refrain from compelling, and let me be clear about what compulsion is, because a lot of things can come to mind: force,
Sure.
threat of force, or fraud.
Yeah.
If you do those things, you're compelling somebody.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you force somebody, everybody says, oh, yeah, I get that. If you threaten to force them if they don't do something, that's also compelling. And the hardest one to understand how that turns out to be force is fraud, what I call guile. I use the word guile as well as fraud, because it's an intentional fraud. You're intending to mislead them, to compel them.
Sure. No, and I mean, the unjustly, you're right. It opens up a can of worms, but by putting that in there, there are things like, okay, we all agree we should be driving on one side of the road so we don't run into each other. Okay, well, let's compel people. There's really no cost. So you can make a pretty good argument that us choosing the right-hand side of the road to drive on is not an unjust compelling for anyone.
We probably wouldn't get much battle on that. We
No.
also compel our children constantly. And we do so because we don't think that they are fully rational yet. And of course, people who study these kinds of things, I've read, say that humans don't become even close to fully rational till they're in their early 20s of all things.
Yeah. And I mean, that's actually that the research, the number I've heard is 25, which is part of actually at our university, right? We're at a liberal arts university with a business school, and I talk to prospective students. I actually discuss the science behind this, right? This is a powerful combination. You're getting a top business education, but you're being forced to think about things in different disciplines from great scholars in different ways. That expands your brain, which is still growing.
You wouldn't choose to by yourself, probably.
Yeah, I mean, everybody would like to say so, but there's a lot of competing interests, and
that's
the reason I offer extra credit for talks when I teach, right? I mean, everybody thinks it'd be great to go to this talk, but it's been a long day. Do I do these other things, right? There's other ideas.
Got to give the incentive.
Yeah. So that's a do not compel others unjustly. It's
That's
good
right.
definition of morality.
The reason I wanted to get it as terse as possible is because I really didn't have an overpowering interest in morality per se, even though the first half of the book deals with what morality is, because my real interest was to make a persuasive and correct, I think it's correct anyway, argument that what we call capitalism is indeed a moral social system of political economy. And then I go on to state in the book, which I no doubt get pushback from any number of people, and I say, and by the way, it's the only social system of political economy that is moral.
So let's go into the definition then of capitalism, because I think that's important. I imagine a number of people watching this, there's people from all perspectives, right? That will be watching, and there will be some coming in here who will probably have heard what you just said and say, well, absolutely. And there's others who will think, oh, well, this is the least moral system. Let's make sure we're all talking about this with the same.
Right.
How do you define capitalism?
And capitalism is not easy to define. And if you head for your Webster's, you're going to get a miserable definition of capitalism, which of course is, being teachers as we are, we know that the first instinct of our students is to look it up in Webster, which is usually the absolute worst thing you could do. So capitalism is difficult to define in a terse, compact set of words. And so what the tack that I took was to first say, well, first of all, capitalism is a social system. It is a system that is either practiced more or less or not more or less by a society. So a social system is what? It's a system in which people live together.
Sure.
A family is a social system. It's the smallest social system that we can imagine is a family, the nuclear family. But of course, a city can be a social system, a state, a region. It's simply, there are lots of different ways to talk about what a social system is, but the first thing that capitalism is social system. And then I say, it's a social system of political economy. Well, what does that mean? Well, that goes itself into philosophical considerations because of the word political. And of course, that goes way, way back to Aristotle and Plato and those guys who didn't really think very much about economics, but they thought a lot about the fact that humans are social creatures. Humans are not solitary creatures. We prefer to be members of a society. And so capitalism is a social system of political economy. Why the word economy? Because as it turns out, there are two major bodies of study, if you will, or ideas, if you will, that attempt to answer the same questions, but in different ways. Okay, and what are those questions? Well, as we all learned way back in Econ 101, the big three questions that all societies necessarily must somehow answer: what to produce using scarce resources, how to do it, and then third, who gets it? Who gets it? And of course, the who gets it's very entertaining and important. Okay, so we've got various social systems that attempt and do answer those questions in different ways. And one of them falls within the realm of what we call politics. The other falls in the realm of what these days we call economics. And of course, as you know, Matt, back in the old days of Adam Smith and those Scottish philosophers and some others back in those days, they didn't have the word economics at all. They didn't use the word economics, but they did speak of the political economy because they recognized that there's a huge intersection between what people who think they're thinking about politics are thinking about, and those who think they're thinking about economics are thinking about. There's a huge intersection. So it's a social system of political economy. Now, that doesn't tell you very much in and of itself. So I go on in the book to explain that there really are four pillars, if you will, four constituent ideas that without which you can't really talk about capitalism. And here's what they are. The first one is private property.
Okay.
And it is the first one because if you don't have private property, you really don't have the second one, which is actually the most important one. But because you have to have private property for it to happen, the second one, I put it second. So private property is the first. If you don't have private property, you don't have capitalism.
Sure.
Whatever else you've got, it ain't capitalism. The second one is voluntary exchange. Now you begin to see why you have to have private property. You can't have voluntary exchange if nobody has any property.
If people don't own that. Yes. Yep.
Yeah. And of course, everybody pretty much agrees that's ever thought about it that everybody owns themselves. And so everybody has some property, even if it's not very much, they at least have themselves. It's ridiculous to talk about you're not owning yourself, even though major wars were fought over it and so forth, with slavery and all that. But everybody agrees, well, you own yourself. And so you got private property, the first pillar, voluntary exchange. That means people just, and when I use the word exchange in the book, I certainly mean commercial exchange, but it's not limited to that. If you think about it in a certain way, every interaction you ever have with another human being is an exchange. And that's a pretty challenging idea, but I'll leave it to your listeners to think about. Every action, the interaction you have with another human being is a kind of exchange. And in most cases, it's not even difficult to see how it's an exchange. But so the concept of exchange means more than just trading. It means more than just barter. It certainly includes barter. It certainly includes, I give you a baseball bat and you give me your bicycle. It certainly includes that kind of exchange. It includes, you go down to McDonald's, you buy a cheeseburger. That's an exchange.
Sure.
But it also includes, I love you. You're exchanging something in return for something else. And that's a little more challenging idea. So what do we got? Private property, voluntary exchange. Okay. And so what do we next have? And this one's really important. If you don't have this, you really don't have capitalism. You must have freedom. You must have freedom. If you say, well, this is capitalism over here. Here's a country that practices capitalism. Oh, well, they don't really practice freedom, though. We have a country that many people have argued has become capitalist in the world today, and it isn't even in the ballpark because it lacks freedom, and that would be China. China emulates some parts of capitalism. They finally have allowed some private property. They've allowed some voluntary exchange and even some freedom, but not very much. Okay. And so you got private property, voluntary exchange, freedom. And the book goes into some detail about each of these, which we don't have time to do today. The fourth pillar is just law. Not just law, but just law.
Just law.
Okay, and we don't have time to go down that rabbit hole because it's a pretty deep one.
Oh, sure,
sure. It's fun to go down there, but very entertaining, very interesting. But you can do that if you read the book, and then you could think about it and read, I don't know, maybe hundreds of other writers that talk about law and what just law is. Okay, but go ahead. So
no, I was going to talk. No, that's a great definition. So you mentioned. So private property, and with it is implied, of course, property rights and voluntary exchange. And you mentioned like owning yourself is fundamental. And so, I mean, getting to this, there are some people who argue that capitalism is the reason for slavery, which, looking at what you said, if somebody doesn't own their own, own themselves, of course, that violates immorality, and it also violates it's not capitalism, according to.
Certainly not capitalism.
Yep, it's not.
Might be something else, but it's not capitalism.
Yep. And then it's interesting, but thinking about private property and property rights, I think it goes to so many things. I did a recent series on the Game of Thrones prequel, House of the Dragon. I don't know if you're a Game of Thrones fan, but
I am, but I haven't seen the prequel.
Well, I think it's what I think is kind of interesting about that is a lot of the problems that they're having is in that show. A lot of the conflict centers around the fact that there are not well-defined property rights.
Right.
And because there aren't well-defined property rights and there is not a just adjudicator for the disputes,
right,
wars happen. And it's kind of fascinating, though. I mean, it kind of goes to these questions of
permeates human history, does it not?
So it goes through there. So okay, we've got the definition of morality, and our 4 pillars of capitalism. And you mentioned then capitalism is the moral system.
It's the only one.
And what is it about capitalism, and how does it fit within this definition?
Okay, and here, if I convince you, which I may not, but if you read the book, I do my best to convince you that morality, any action, first of all, just actions that are moral or immoral. So, it's your behavior that's either moral or immoral, each person. So long as you refrain from compelling others unjustly, whatever it is that you're doing is moral. It may not be virtuous, however. There's a distinction that I draw readers' attentions to between the difference between morality and virtue. So we don't want to go down that rabbit hole too deep either, because it's very entertaining and interesting. Chapter 4 is all about it, as a matter of fact. But in any case, so a lot of people, if you say morality, the first thing that pops into their mind is something about sex, right? Sex is either moral or immoral, because that's just what they have always thought about it. That's all they thought about. A lot of things that or actions, some people would say, well, that's not moral. And chapter 4 in my book gives some examples of that. But if you just focus in, well, morality, if as long as your behavior is not compelling, it's not forcing, it's not threatening force, nor is it purposefully defrauding somebody, okay, then your behavior is moral, even if it's not virtuous, even if nobody likes your behavior. So the way I put it in the book is that you cannot be virtuous without first being moral, but you can be moral without having an ounce of virtue.
Okay.
Believe it or not. And you'll have to read the book if you don't immediately understand that. We talk about that at some, not length, but enough to understand that.
Yeah, you dive into it, right?
Yeah, we talk about it. I talk about it in the book. So you got moral behavior is just that. And then now I've lost the second idea that we were talking about here.
So it's just why is capitalism moral?
Oh, okay.
Why is capitalism
it becomes,
the moral system?
and that becomes so simple. One, if I convince you that, yeah, I think that's a good definition for morality, I get that, I agree with that, then here's the reason capitalism, real capitalism, as I define it, and invite you to consider those ideas in the book. Here's why capitalism is moral and why every other system of political economy is not. Real capitalism compels no one.
Yeah.
Period. Doesn't. It's all voluntary. Real capitalism embodies, as we said, private property. You got to have something to exchange. If you don't, you couldn't have capital. In fact, you couldn't have society, by the way. And as long as exchanges are voluntary, you're not being compelled. If I'm not forcing you, I'm not threatening to force you, and I'm not fooling you, then you're not being compelled. It's voluntary. Okay? Well, capitalism is the only system of political economy, the only social system of political economy that even pretends that you don't compel. Think of alternative systems of social economy, political economy. Well, the first one that you could think of is just outright despotism. Okay, you got a strong man, and the strong man says, you're going to do this, otherwise I'm probably going to just kill you. Okay, well, that's clearly you're compelling. Okay, that's the easiest one. And then, of course, many students that we teach today, for whatever reasons, have become enthralled with the notion of socialism, right? Well, socialism, they say, socialism seems to me, they say, the way to go, because it just seems fair and it just seems good and so forth. But guess what? In socialism, something that we call the state owns all the productive resources, including you. They own the land, they own the labor, they own the capital, and they tell you what to do with it. That's compulsion.
Sure.
And they say, and by the way, if you don't, well, we'll probably just have to kill you. People don't like it when I put it that way, Matt. They say, gosh, you have to be so dramatic about it. And I said, well, actually we do, because it's exactly what happens. Even Karl Marx finally admitted that communism would never happen without force.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Okay, so that's another system of political economy that is akin to socialism. In fact, you have been entertaining symposia on the differences, conceivable differences between communism and socialism, which are next to worthless in my mind, but never mind, we could. So think of any system of political economy, any social system of political economy, and you will find, aside from true capitalism, they all require compulsion.
So I know I'm trying to predict what somebody who wants to push back on this is going to say. And I mean, I can imagine somebody, could be some of our students are watching and saying, well, the reason I like socialism is this is the system that's trying to help the poor. And so therefore, I do think this is moral, because this is the system that helps. What's the response to that? I think I might know what it is, but
you probably do. I'm confident as you know exactly the answer. But my good friend Matt is playing devil's advocate here. So What about socialism, which has drawn any number of young devotees? We teach them in our colleges and universities today, and of course, some professors teach them that socialism is a grand idea. So, what about when they say, well, it's fair and right and good to take from Bill and give it to Jill? That's a good thing because Jill doesn't have anything and Bill does. And so if we just require, they use different words. They don't like the word force. Okay. So they'll say, we'll require, or we will mandate that Bill give some of his stuff to Jill. Okay. Well, surely everyone will recognize that Bill won't like that idea, probably. He might like the idea of giving Jill some things if he voluntarily gets to, but he's going to definitely object if you tell him you must. And by the way, if you do not comply, we'll just make you. Bill's not going to like that. He's being compelled.
Yep.
Okay. So these students would say, well, wait a minute. Jill needs this food, for example. She doesn't have any food. So Bill's got plenty of food. We're going to take some of Bill's food, give it to Jill. And that's why we like socialism, because it's taking care of the poor. It's taking care of the oppressed. And we like that. And so what you've got to ask yourself is, okay, is it moral to do that? And my claim is that everyone knows that it is not moral. They might still argue that it's good, but that goes to the idea of virtue. Moral behavior is right behavior. Immoral behavior is wrong behavior. Right and wrong for humans, not for squirrels or turtles or anything, but for humans, which have that characteristic attribute called rationality. And I go into this in some detail in the book. We don't have time to do that here today in the first part of the book. But for humans, for us, for people, moral behavior is right behavior, even if it's not good behavior.
Sure. And so
Okay.
diving in, pushing, kind of pushing back a little bit more, right? So we have individuals who are poorer, who there's some subset that will struggle to kind of take care of themselves.
Yes.
Without help, what is the right response then?
Well, as it happens, very, very few people who are moral actors are dispassionate about helping others. Very few. Most people, and in fact, I will simply tell you, I'm old. I've been on planet Earth 73 years now, and hope to be here a few more. And in all of my time on planet Earth, I have never met a person who is scrupulous about being moral who is not also generous. Just haven't.
Sure.
You say, well, it's possible. Well, a lot of things are possible. So what? The question is it prominent? Is it characteristic of humans to be uncaring about other humans? And the answer is absolutely not. In fact, I argue in the very opening of my book that almost every person wishes to be seen by his fellows, by her fellows, as moral. And they want to be seen as virtuous. Russ Roberts wrote a book about Adam Smith and moral sentiments, one of the neglected books of Adam Smith, where he points out that Adam Smith pointed out in the theory of moral sentiments that people want to be seen as good people by their fellow citizens. And we do. We do. Even Machine Gun Crowley, who mowed down people back in the days of Prohibition with machine guns, just wantonly killed them, wanted to be seen as a good person. Hitler wanted to be seen and thought himself to be a good person. This is incredible to us when we stop and think about it. So what about people like Jill, or in my book, it's Callie. Callie's the poor one in Threesville. Use a construct I call Threesville. We got Annie, Bobby, and Callie. And Annie's rich, and Bobby's middle guy, and Callie, she's just poor. But see, it turns out that Annie and Bobby both care about her being poor, and voluntarily will help her. Voluntarily, they don't have to be forced. And I point out I guess it's in chapter 8 of the book, where I talk a little bit about the fact that in early America, where there were no taxes, by the way, there was no federal income tax at all back in the early days of the founders. People subscribed to projects like paving the streets of Philadelphia. They didn't do that with tax dollars. What they did is they went around and said, would you contribute? I mean, these streets are dirty, dusty, and when it's dry, they're dusty, and when it's rainy, they're muddy. We want to pave them. Would you subscribe to this and give us some of your wealth to get this done? And guess what happened? They did.
People did.
They did. So the notion that it's just wrong-headed, and I guess we have to blame our colleagues in economics for some of the wrong-headedness. It's just wrong that people don't care about other people. They do, and it's just wrong to think that they won't subscribe to worthy projects. They do and have and would in the future.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, Matt, some number of economists used to argue that, well, if you didn't have government to force people to do this, there wouldn't be any lighthouses to keep the ships off the shoals. And as it happens, of course, there were.
Yeah.
There were.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned economists are somewhat to blame, right? In the beginning, you talk about people, a goal is to maximize utility, right? Like the self-interest, but often the self-interest, sometimes the self-interest is feeling good for helping others.
Well, absolutely. I use a construct that I've used for many years to teach students. I call it the fundamental hypothesis of economics, and I write about it in my book. Yeah. The fundamental hypothesis of economics says that people choose those actions they believe will yield themselves their largest net benefit.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. I consider that the fundamental hypothesis of economics, because if it's not the case, then all the rest of economics is useless and worthless for study, because we build everything on that single idea. And so if it's useful, then good, and if it's not, then we should abandon economics. So I tell my students, Mother Teresa behaved that way too. It's just that the things she valued were different than the things you valued, maybe.
It's a good way.
But she also, people scratch their heads about that for a minute, and they say, well, wait a minute. Mother Teresa, she was a saint. She gave everything. She helped the poor. She built a leprosarium, for goodness sakes, with the money that she earned for the Nobel Prize that she got awarded. And I say, yes, and she also was choosing those actions which she believed would yield her largest net benefit. And if you think about that for a minute, that's because she valued so greatly the welfare of others.
That's a great way to think. I might borrow that example the next time. I like it.
It's a fascinating example, actually. Yeah. And so over the years, I've seen light bulbs go off in people's heads when they realize that doesn't mean you're evil just because you're pursuing your own self-interest. Sure. Doesn't mean you may be laudable, just like Mother Teresa.
Yep. So we only have a few minutes left. So we talked about capitalism, other systems. So is the United States then, could we define it as a capitalist society?
Okay, and so this is a very interesting topic that we talk about in the book as well. There's no such thing. Capitalism exists on a continuum. Okay, at the one hand, I will put pure despotism at one end of the continuum, and at the other end of the continuum is pure capitalism. Okay, well, there's no country on earth today, and there has never been one on earth that was at the end of the continuum of pure capitalism. Okay, so every country, every social system, every society is somewhere in between. Now, if I ask people, okay, so write down two countries you think are on the one end of the continuum that is closest to pure despotism, and then write down a couple of other countries, two or three, that you think are much closer to the other end of the continuum. Well, where would we find the United States? We would probably find it well past the midpoint of the continuum toward the end of pure capitalism. But if you think about it, I do think about it in the book and point out in one of the chapters that the United States is pretty far from the end that we would call pure capitalism, that I would call pure capitalism. We're still closer to it than so many other countries in the world. I actually call what we practice in the United States different. I don't call it capitalism.
Yeah.
I call it, of all things, democratic cronyism. Why do I call it democratic cronyism? Well, it's democratic because we get to vote. It's cronyism because it just plain out is cronyism. As it happens, I teach public choice economics, Buchanan and Turlock and all those guys, and principally Buchanan, who theories of public choice economics is politics without romance, as James Buchanan called it. And so I call it, what we do in the United States, democratic cronyism, because I find so much cronyism involved in what we do in our official forms of government, frankly. And so I'm a little biased. Well, no, I'm totally biased. I'll just be deadly honest with you. Of course, everybody is biased, so I don't apologize for it. We're coming from a particular perspective. Mine is that we have a long way to go before we could get closer to true capitalism. And in chapter 8 of the book, I actually come up with a couple of prescriptions that I think would move us there, and then we could have great fun, multiple symposia about these and all that. But of course, we can't do that today.
No, well, that's a good place to end. And once again, if you haven't read the book, right, it's a great cliffhanger to encourage those to pick up a copy of the book. And once again, there will be a link.
And I want to do this before we have to move on. I want to give people my email address, and you're certainly welcome to post it on your YouTube channel. But I'll just mention it right now because it's pretty easy to remember. It's DLK8F. That's DLK8F at virginia.edu. So that you could probably remember that, but Matt will post it. And because I'm more interested in more people reading this book than anything else. If you can't get it any other way, you can get it easily on Amazon. You can get it for Kendall for next to nothing. You can get it in paperback for next to nothing. But if you've got even less than next to nothing, send me an email and I will send you a PDF copy of the book.
No, that's very generous. Thank you. Yeah, and we will put that email in the description as well. So.
And I actually will do it. So
no, that's great. Well, if you watch this, right, I would expect, some of you probably agreed with much of this. Some of you might not have. Leave a comment. If you disagree with something, let us know. Leave a comment in the comments section, and David and/or I might respond. I'll probably leave it to David if it's questioning some of his words than me trying to defend, his words on this. If you enjoyed this video, please click like. It helps other people. It helps with the YouTube algorithms, and it helps other people see the content. And I try to produce videos like this pretty regularly. So if you subscribe to the channel, you'll get notified when new videos come out. But David, thanks again for joining today. I really appreciate your time.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me.
Well, and thanks to everybody watching. We'll see you in the next video.
Bye-bye.